This is the kickoff of a new concept, which is called Inspiring Dialogues. It's a dialogue between inspiring alumni of Delft University of Technology. And today we have Mickey Huibregtsen. He graduated in the late 60s, cum laude, technical mechanics. And amongst a lot of inspiring things, he had a very interesting career. And he had a lot of interesting initiatives. He advised almost every corporate company, and he was with McKinsey, the consultancy, for over 13 years as a chairman, Benelux. And he recently published this book, Management Made Simple, and in which he shares a lot of knowledge and experience, and that comes together in this book. We will come to that later on. He also was the chairman of the NOC NSF, which is short for Dutch Sport Federation. And we are going to talk with Mickey Huibregtsen about societal development and how he says less I and more we. For that, he is the chair of an initiative called the Publieke Zaak, and which is an inspirational platform and which puts societal impact on the agenda. And we will come to all these subjects. And when I spoke to him in preparation of this lunch meeting, he said, I want to change things, and what we need are constructive, positive rebels. As you can hear, a man with a vision and an enormous drive. Ladies and gentlemen, a warm applause, Mickey Huibregtsen. To start with, your typical Delft way of looking at the world, what brought it you?
I think engineering is a good way to start problem solving. Basically in life there's only two things you have to be very good at. That's problem solving and communication, passive and active. And if you're good at those two things, you can master almost any skill, any field of interest. Now, engineering helps solving problems. When I started my career at the mechanical engineering department, there were 17 courses which were all based on deflection of bars, etc., but they were all simplifications of reality. And when I ended, I found out this was all governed by 9 partial differential equations. So you ask yourself the question, why don't we start with the partial differential equations and then do all the rest? But learning is about understanding simplicity, and so it takes a long time to get there. That's the experience I had. And taking no for an answer, obviously, is something which is in line with engineers.
Okay, so simplicity. And a simple question, because you've been for McKinsey for over 30 years. What's the main difference then and now for companies?
Oh, there is a very visible difference. I always exaggerate. You'll get used to that over the next couple of minutes. But basically when I started, which was in 1970 as a management consultant, the world stood still in relative terms. In other words, companies that made strategies basically assumed that the competition wouldn't move, that the markets wouldn't change, that the currency would remain the same, etc., etc. When I left the firm, I always told all my younger colleagues that life is too fast, too diverse, too rapidly changing. You can't give any answers anymore. I mean, we started out in the 70s giving yes-no answers plus 1,200 reasons why it was yes or no. And when I ended, I said we can only ask questions because there's a structural uncertainty. Those of you who've studied chaos mathematics, when I read that book by Jim Glick, I highly recommend it, called Chaos. It tells you something about chaos mathematics, but it helps you understand most issues in life. That is, most things are unpredictable. And that is, today, most things are unpredictable. That's a very old student of mine. So most things are unpredictable, and therefore our requirements for management have really moved from, for instance, from perfection, which you used to strive for, to performance. Because perfection today isn't the answer for a problem tomorrow. Performance, that is being able to respond and find new solutions, is far more important than being perfect. And so there's fundamental change.
Okay. Let's go to your NOC NSF tijd. You've been a sporter yourself. You have been...
I was, yeah, until this happened. I have to apologize for the lag on this stool, but this lag is stiff, and people always ask you, can't you bend it a little bit? And the answer is unfortunately no. Otherwise it hangs in the air, so I got to do something with it. Yes.
But you were national squash champion
yes.
of the Netherlands
yes, that
once.
was great.
You
the greatest achievement in my time. I played top league field hockey and tennis, but when I was chairman of the Olympic Committee, I took the press to Atlanta, the Olympic Games in Atlanta in 1986, I think. Yeah. On the flight back, I realized that it would help the prestige of the Olympic Committee if I became national champion in something. And the only thing I did at the time was playing squash, which I'd started at age 45 or something. So I inquired when the next national competition was for my age group, which happened to be next week, Saturday. I'd never played any competition, but to make a long story short, I became national champion, and it's the biggest achievement in my life. In a very narrow age category, obviously. But
you were chairman of the NOC NSF, the world of sports. What did it taught you?
The world of sport is a wonderful simplification of reality, and therefore it is a wonderful instrument to make comparisons in business. The other day I asked myself the question, why are sports stars so celebrated rather than Nobel Prize laureates? And the reason is simple, because most of us understand what it takes to be a good soccer player. Very few of us understand what it takes to be a Nobel laureate. So it's the masses that judge, and that's true for stars. And one of my initiatives is to start an evening of science and society, which is directed at celebrating scientists for what they do and recognizing their importance to our country. Back to sports. Wonderful illustrations. When I talked about organization in corporations, I always showed the traditional model, which I call the Einstein Model, with a smart person at the top who knows all the answers, and then blocks and divisions, basically, ideally consisting of robots that execute the wonderful idea at the top. And I now would turn this around and make it all in rounds and show the setup of a soccer team. And then you make the comparison. Say a soccer team has certain advantages over a normal organization. A soccer team, everybody knows where the goal is. If you ask the average employee of Shell, Unilever, or Philips what the goal of the corporation is, they haven't got a clue. A soccer team has the advantage, if the guy next to you fails, you try to solve it. In the average corporation, if the guy or girl next to you fails, then you point at him and say he's failed. And so there's all kind of very useful comparisons. The one I use in my book, which I really like, is called the blue bag syndrome, which is a sports example of discontinuity. And in this case, it's the industry is the high jump sector. Now, you would argue that high jump, nothing has really changed in the high jump because gravity has remained the same, et cetera, But there was one thing that had changed and that had been staring all the high jumpers in the face. That is that originally, after the Second World War, you would, behind the bar, you would put some remnants of old mattresses in a big heap until we could afford to make it a new one with a blue bag around it. And then came Dick Fosbury in, I think it was the LA Olympics, I think, who jumped with his head first because this mattress was so soft that you could fall on your neck. And that thing has been staring high jumpers in the face for 20 years before somebody took that, interpreted that, and made that jump. And now everybody does the same.
Which brings us to change. You want to change things, and that's one of the things why you initiated de publieke zaak.
The public cause, translated.
Yeah. Back to, as we call in Dutch, de menselijke maat. More we and less I. Explain.
I always call myself a world improver third class because I have a tendency to see opportunity everywhere. And in my view, everything can be done better. And the two areas where I'm most concerned is, one is the area of our society, the way we interact with each other. And the real cause of the problem there is that we've all been told that we have entitlements, we have rights, we have human rights, wonderful. But nobody has ever suggested that you can't have rights without obligations. So if you tell people for 50 years that they have rights, entitlements, and no obligation, they get used to that. You can't blame that they insist on being a consumer rather than also be a producer, contribute to society. So the one argument is to market a mindset that caring for other people, doing somebody for somebody else, taking initiative and cooperating is fat cool, whatever the modern terminology. At one point in time, I was au courant with all the terminology, but it's different in every part of this country, so you have to be very careful. So I use fat cool, which is probably from 20 years ago. So that's the one area of involvement. The other area of involvement is the societal infrastructure, the organizations, the institutions that we have, the processes that we have are totally outdated. They are 2 centuries old. Our political system was built in the 19th century. And hasn't changed since. The size of the provinces is determined by the reach of the postal coach. And so we need to redesign most of our society from the ground up. So it's society itself and the infrastructure that we have to, in my view, fundamentally improve. But then people say, but we're doing much better than most other countries, which is true. I grant you directly that the Netherlands is probably one of the most advanced economies and societies in the world. There are very few that can compete with it. But on the other hand, I see such an opportunity in education, in healthcare, in politics, in mobility, in almost any topic you can think of to do much better. One of the things we did recently, we're going to publish this book, More We, about cooperation in the 21st century. The argument is we should cooperate far more rather than fight each other, because most of us want the same thing, with very few exceptions. So the issue is not what we want, the issue is how do we make it happen. And that requires cooperation. Now, that is a challenge for the future, which I try to make happen. It's a long haul.
And can you tell us what typically a Delft engineer can do in that?
Oh, a Delft engineer can be less bot than he used to be, like me. In other words, a Delft engineer, most advancement in society comes from engineers. There's no doubt about that. The most successful engineers go beyond their technical capabilities and have also societal contribution, have society at heart in creating solutions. And that's what you really can do. And you all are gifted people. And in my view, that means you have an obligation for society. If you are in the preferential position that all of you are in, that you have the knowledge, the capability, the survival opportunity, you have to contribute to society. And it's great to do that. There's nothing more enjoyable than doing something useful for somebody else.
And change starts with small things. Can you tell us the story behind the pin?
The pin this is our logo of the public cause and society. The website is www.maatschappij.nu. What we're trying to achieve is more we, and the ampersand is a symbol for we. And what we do with this is a little recognition for people at any level in society that do something useful, contribute to society. As an organization, we want to do 3 things: inspire, facilitate, and celebrate. We do far too little celebration amongst each others. So what we do here, this comes with a very little card, which when I spent 7 years in the hospital with leukemia, etc., I gave to one of the nurses who'd been particularly useful. And the card will say, "Thank you for what you do for society. We appreciate it." People are so touched by a simple recognition, a simple celebration of somebody being useful. And we do far too little of that. So what we're trying to do is promote the notion of caring for each other.
But it's a movement, it's a culture change, which needs patience. as I can assume, not one of your competences.
Yeah,
No.
that's strange because I've only been working on this for 16 years now, so and it still has to move really beyond what my expectations. But no, these are very long-term aspirations. But without aspirations, where the hell do you get? So.
In the book, you say something about the quantum leap. What's the quantum leap in the publieke zaak you dream of?
I consider publieke zaak as a kind of brush fire, which at some point in time will suddenly flare up, and people will recognize. We hope to use this logo as an indication of a movement where people increasingly care about each other, care about their environment, treat their co-citizens with respect, etc., rather than being totally selfish. I mean, our constitutional concept of 17 parties, of which about 15 have a single party interest, over 50, green, animals, or anything of that kind, is totally contrary to my view of a society. Society is not a game of interests that fight each other. No, it's a game of players that cooperate and thereby have impact. And that's what we try to do. Now, Quantum Leap was another wonderful example for sports. Actually, there are very few physics about, except that elderly gentleman over there. There are very few physics here that a quantum leap is, I think, the smallest possible leap that you can make. But in management terms, it means a very distinct leap. And that is also one of the things. There was the long jump. In addition to the high jump, we had the long jump. And there was one guy who increased the world record in the long jump by about, I think, 42 centimeters. And that record has stood for 20 years before it was again improved. So that was an enormous jump. In maatschappij and the public cause, we'll have to grind on and hope that someday it will flare up. And that's what we need.
Okay, let's go to the book. This book is an answer to the overwhelming challenge to run a business within a more complex and a fast-changing world. The first 50 has got a free book. Who's got it already? Yeah, very good, very good. The necessity of this book has several roots, like the accelerating pace of change and the increasing globalization, but you also mentioned the exploding emotional revolution and the expanding role of corporations in society. Can you explain those two?
Yeah, I've been promoting, although very few people that know me well would not associate emotions directly with me. I've been promoting the emotional revolution for over 25 years. And the argument being that because of most products and services moving to a status of commodity, that most buying decisions, acquiring decisions, both business to consumer and business to business, start to have a high emotional content. And therefore, you have to take into account that emotional content in considering how to position your product and service. Why do people buy Rolexes? Not because they run any better. To the contrary, I think all evidence is there that Rolexes break down much faster than almost any other watch. So mine is about $8. Because they associate something. So it's a purely emotional experience. And we have that in fashion, but we have that in many things. And even in the business-to-business decision to hire a supplier, there's a high emotional content in that. So that is, I think, much more to have employees. I mean, 40, 50 years ago, you wouldn't think of them as I have to stimulate them emotionally, also, although some smart managers did. But these days, you have to really think about your employees in emotional terms, because that's all that counts. If they want to cooperate, they're at least twice as productive as if they don't. So everything is full of emotions, and it's, for some engineers, including myself, understanding emotions is tough in the beginning, but it's important to recognize them and think about them and experiment. because you can't predict emotions, like the stock market. The stock market is a derivative of an opinion. And that's very hard to predict, because you have to understand mass interaction, et cetera, et cetera. So those are two things, but let me tell you why I wrote the book. There's two things in my mind. I already mentioned chaos mathematics. The pace of change in our society is continuously accelerating. And the impact of that is that everything becomes more and more unstable. Change is more and more pervasive. And as a result of that, the future is less and less predictable. And complexity that results from that, in my view, can only be dealt with by simplicity. So I've come up with 35 simple ideas that I gained in my experience as a consultant and working with many people and organizations. The other argument is that most management books are based on one idea, and which you understand, pick up from the first 3 pages, and then you have to read it another 297, which only elaborate on the one idea you have. So this book is half the size of the average management book, 150 pages or 35 ideas. So the rate of page per idea or idea per page is much better than average. Whether the ideas are any good, you have to judge for yourself.
And you also tell us something in the book about the expanding role of corporations in society. Can you tell something about more?
In my view, large corporations are societal institutions. I think shareholder value, I mean, it may sound strange from a McKinsey man, but I've always considered shareholder value to be a terrible concept. We have to make a distinction between market economics and capitalism. And those are two different things. We need market economies, we need competition to strive for the better and get better results. But we don't need capitalism in terms of control of society by shareholders. We certainly don't need that, and it's certainly a threat these days that we have to fight. So corporations have far more to focus, as the original Rhineland model that the Netherlands in particular supported. We need to consider stakeholders and their interests, and we've got to run large corporations taking into account the relative importance of our various stakeholders. And it's definitely sure that your customers and your employees are far more important than your shareholders. So, but it's tough to start behaving that way, as Paul Polman of Unilever tried and was immediately attacked. He was one of the few that really stuck their neck out to change that. So that's a challenge.
Okay, then my last question before we go to the questions from the audience. In your book, you advocate the importance of leadership. Can you tell me the main message of this topic?
Yeah, leadership is a concept that's not well understood, but I try to help a little bit by describing 3 possible roles for a leader. And that is, you're either a role as a pioneer, running ahead of the troops and having a vision. You also can be at some point in time a coach and a player amidst the players in the middle. Or you can be a shepherd, running behind the troops and seeing that all is good. And the real challenge for leadership is to decide which role when to play. So at some point in time you have to be a pioneer, at the other points in time you have to be a shepherd. At other times you have to be a player coach. And to be a player coach, you have to be able to do something that people recognize. You learn your most from all your mistakes. One of my earliest jobs was to lead as a graduated engineer, long study here, designed a submarine, all kind of things. And my first real job was running 70 fitters on the installation of engine and boiler room in a naval frigate. This was at the time that all these engine rooms were full of asbestos. And it became patently obvious after a couple of weeks that I had no clue what these guys were doing, because I was good in partial differential equations, but they didn't know what partial differential equations were. So I didn't function very effectively as a boss until 2 things turned out. And I could talk half an hour, but I'll do it in a quarter of a minute. I could stand any sea, and it was Bow 411 most of the time, and I could stand any amount of booth, which I'd learned in that. And from one day to the other, I was a natural leader, because those were two things they admired. So it's important, if you are a leader, you have to have contact with your led. And that contact is established by recognition of your talents, but they can only recognize your talents if they understand them. So that's a real challenge.
Well, thank you. As Inspiring Dialogue says, we have some time for questions. We have a box which is going to be thrown to you if you have a question. Please introduce yourself short and have some questions. Who has one?
Hello, thank you for the talk. Yes, you mentioned that actually the government and other structures in society are outdated.
Yeah.
And I was wondering what ideas you have on different structures to encourage cooperation and communication, because I think it would be quite difficult.
No, it is. You're absolutely right. I'm better at raising the topic than answering giving the solution. And this is particular because of our dynamic environment. We have to experiment. One of my lead thoughts in thinking about solutions is going back to the human dimension. We have to act in human dimensions. So we have to try to move most of our societal safety net to a level and a size of groups that understand each other and have feedback. Because we now have solutions, government solutions, without any feedback loop. No government policy has a feedback loop of any significance. You're entitled, so you get something, but there's nothing in return. So there's no check and balance in the system. So the net result is everybody misuses, black or white, rich or poor, misuses every government system. So go back to the human dimension. This is one. The most difficult challenge, in my view, is how to organize democracy. And I must admit, I don't have the answer, but I believe we have to experiment. Again, I mean, I'm against, which is referenda, and the reason, because referenda supposedly represent the voice of the people, but unfortunately, any referendum I've participated in, I would have to admit honestly that I did not have enough information to make the real choice. Like people about Brexit or Ukraine or Europe, people do not have the necessary information to make a real worthwhile decision. Now, if we can't make the decision, there are very few people in this country that can. So the net result of a referendum is purely an emotional outburst. And you can only hold referenda on topics that are only impacted by emotions, like black peat. You could have a referendum on black peat, but beyond that, it's almost impossible. So we can't have a referendum. What we can do is, and modern technology will help us that, we can raise integrated system, and there's a software program called Synthetron, where you can access 1 million people simultaneously on a topic. And you group them in small groups, and you let them debate in the small groups, and the best ideas out of the group is a kind of survival, go to the next level. And that way you can poll 1 million people in internal debate and get a useful end product out of that. So, but the base theory to the solution, in my view, is experiment. I know where I want to be, I haven't got a clue how I get there.
Is that an answer to your question?
Yeah, actually, I think the answer is that to start, at the lower levels of people, individual to communities, and then at some point in the top, it will also change. So I think that's a good answer, yeah.
Yeah, well, one of my, if any of you want to experiment, that'd be great. One of my hobbies that I've tried to realize in the last 15 years is a weekly radio program with a time motion study of our House of Commons, where we would evaluate the topics discussed in the House of Commons on a scale of 1 to 10, relevance to the country, the quality of the structure of the discussion on a scale of 1 to 10, and the reliability of the facts. That would be one of the funniest programs in the week, and you would force the House of Commons to start behaving. But you have to realize one thing. I'm always critical about our politicians, but not about them individually, but about them collectively. And the reason is that a culture develops which it's very hard to withdraw yourself from. And the culture in politics is deadly. It's not constructive. As a political party, you have to fight other parties, while with the exception of abortion and a few other topics, and the most important one, which is never discussed, poor versus rich, we all want the same thing. We want to protect the weak in an effective manner, and we ourselves want to have the best view and possibilities for the future. So the challenge is not what we want, the challenge is how do we get there, which is an organizational challenge. That doesn't make it any easier, but recognizing that it's an organizational challenge and not an ideological challenge is very important. And that's where engineers can come in.
We go to the next question. Can you please throw the debating box to the person here? Please introduce yourself.
Thanks. I'm Bastian. Thanks very much for organizing this. My question is about a quote I read recently, which said that more or less it's a waste that the brightest people in our society spend more time analyzing company and products than building them. And well, you've obviously spent a large time of your life
I'm not one of the brightest people, so
analyzing things, but you're also an engineer. So what do you think about that? And could you translate it in some sort of career advice maybe to engineers who are thinking about which path to go down?
The one recommendation I gave, I just shared it with my interviewer, a little booklet which I produced for my grandchildren with little lessons for life. The most important lesson, in my view, is live in peace with yourself. Start recognizing what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are. Try to do a little bit about your weaknesses, but don't worry too much. But live in peace, because if you live in peace, you can afford an independent opinion, a view, and then pursue your talents, what you really like to do. I strongly believe that class education, also in university, will be totally eliminated in the next 10 to 15 years, and we go to individual education, which will allow us to develop far more talents amongst our students than we have these days. So that's an important thing. And thirdly, I think there's certain fundamental values. Feel responsible for the world around you and take action on those areas where you feel most comfortable of taking action. All my action in the societal impact is directed to the Netherlands. My argument is if we can't solve the problems in the Netherlands, we certainly can't solve them anywhere else. But I respect people that focus on Africa or any other topic. But do what you think and really try to contribute. There's nothing as great as giving. If you survive. I mean, you first have to survive. But most of you are on the level of survival, so you can give.
Is that an answer to your question? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Next one. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, Vedwaal. I was very curious about what you said about your maatschap wij nu. And it's not about the me as so much as the us. And I'm just wondering if you have any cultural or international aspects on that, because I'm not sure where it originated from. But I realize that there's a lot of people trying to solve problems in management or in sustainability, and it's very local rather than as a whole, because in the end...
Universal.
Yeah, universal.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that is the real question is, can you solve these problems top down or bottom up, and where do you start, and how do you move? And I am grown internationally. I was flying to New York 13 times a year, a couple of times around the globe, and a few things else. So I realized at one point in time that my roots were in the middle of the Atlantic. And that's when I decided to accept the chairmanship of the Olympic Committee and put my roots in the Netherlands. But there are cultural walls between many countries. And so you got to fight on two fronts. I believe strongly, for instance, in Europe, but the question is, when I say I believe in Europe, what Europe do I mean? Because at the same time, I see a Europe which is totally dysfunctional in most of its organizations. Nevertheless, Europe as a concept itself is a great concept, so it's not, that is very difficult. There's I'll make some extra publicity. There's a little pan-European party right now, it's called Volt. Anyone heard of Volt? One, good, great. That has to be multiplied very soon because we only have 3 months to go. I talked to the Dutch chapter of Volt. They're young people, and they very positively, they're constructive rebels. Unfortunately, they're using the same instruments that other politicians have failed with, but it's a sideline. But that's an attempt to get the international movement. I'm very concerned about all the nationalistic tendencies that we've seen everywhere in the States, but also in Europe. And so I think we have to, and I think Delft is a wonderful example of many nationalities working together. I understand a quarter of you is at least from outside the country. So let's work on it. Let's experiment and let anybody take his own initiative.
Okay, thank you. Is there any question? There were two. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Michiel, and I have a question about the role of companies for society. Yeah. You already said something about it, but I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on how this would look in practice if big companies like Shell would implement these ideas.
Yeah, that is what they have to do, and that is currently they have to survive and operate in a highly capitalistic society, totally driven by shareholders. It's very hard to withdraw yourself from that environment single-handedly, so it's a long-term process. Paul Polman, the CEO of Unilever that just stepped down per January 1, on the first day he took in started his current job as CEO, he discontinued quarterly reporting. And the shareholder value went down by, I think, 4% in 1 day. But his argument was quarterly reporting is ridiculous because it's all short-term driven and a corporation is about long-term events. So getting from where we are, driven by angry shareholders, and I hate I'm a shareholder myself, obviously, but I hate them because in their behavior, I mean, most of them are totally dysfunctional. The companies that are doing really well are some of the family companies, family-owned companies, because they have a far more balanced perspective on the real objectives of the corporation. But getting there is a slow process, and it has to come from the bottom up. It can only partially be created by government, because government can only act through instructions and laws, etc., etc. And we've seen all those things, and they don't seem to function. I mean, we still get bigger separation between large corporations, and large corporations become a threat to society because they control. I mean, certainly in economies where the political system is totally driven by money, like in the US, large corporations start owning the country one way or the other. I exaggerate, you know. But so getting out there is a long haul. But one of the things that gets them out there is young people, and that's the one very positive message I have from this entire session, is young people are far more societally interested than my generation and the later generations were. You guys and girls are far more interested in society, and you ask yourself the question when you join an organization, what is the usefulness, the societal usefulness of this organization? And that's a very good question. And large organizations will start realizing if they don't meet the requirements of potential future employees that they will have to change. And that's what we have to wait for. But it's going to happen. But it takes it takes patience.
We have one question left. Two. Okay. And then we start college again. It's for you, the first one.
Thank you for the talks and all these events. My name is Amalia, and I want to ask about, earlier you said that the best way to deal with complexity of the environment is by responding it with a simple action. But if we talk about from a corporate point of view, suppose that there is like this disruptive technology that threatens the current business process of the corporate. I would like to know how should this corporation deal with it? I mean, a corporation has like a different division, right? From the human resource, the business process model, or the business. And I would like to know how should the corporation adapt to the change itself from the environment? Thank you.
Yeah, I think increasingly corporations will be driven by values. I mean, you can only move people by values, not by instructions anymore. So a corporation does have to have a perspective also on the environment when they interact significantly with the environment. And I think in the long run, they will be rewarded for paying attention to these new causes. And so have the examples in the Netherlands are the same too. I already mentioned Unilever and DSM are the two leading or most visible large corporations that really have a strong environmental interest, and they're recognized for that. And in addition, their employees are inspired by it. So that's a very significant measure. But from time to time, there's outside forces beyond your control. When a shareholder meeting is forcing you to take a certain road, for instance, not putting Unilever's headquarters in Rotterdam, then you can't withstand that pressure. So it's a stumble along kind of process to get this done. But it will happen. And the only challenge is to accelerate it.
Last question, the back. Can you throw it?
Thank you very much. My name is Antal, and I would like to ask you about how you envision individuals finding their talents. You have already implicitly said a couple of pieces of your opinion. In more specifics, I'm really curious what you think about universal income and what kind of effect it could have on our society.
Okay, let me start at primary education, if I may. Since I'm deeply involved in primary education, and I'm investing in all kinds of societal objectives. And this is a company called S-School Suite that provides a technology that allows a primary school to basically give individual education rather than class-based education. And I strongly believe that because I strongly believe that most people are shaped between age 4 and 13. And most of their talents are accessed and developed. And we dramatically undervalue the potential of kids in the way we educate them. Now, in a way, that same holds true for university, for academia. And I think academia will have to move in a far more differentiated, individualized teaching environment, where most of the direct didactic material comes from the internet and not from a professor. Because 9 out of 10 times what internet provides on education and didactic material is classes better than the average professor. Also, you can take it at your own pace, you can replay, start all over again, and so you can actively participate. So I see an enormous, the MOOCs are clearly a start, but they're basically modernizing old technology. It's the old technology of class education, which is modernized by putting a camera in front of it. But what you really need is education that is far more internet-based, and whereby the interaction with the professor is far more in a debating environment, and a debating situation, but also talking to some of your co-students in little groups. That's where education will find its ultimate shape, in my view.
Thank you very much. As we can hear, college is going to begin again, so we're going to end this. Thank you very much for being here and having your lunch at the inspiring dialogue. And thank you very much, Mickey Huibregtsen. A warm applause, please.
Thank you.